The Scholars Chair presents an article in review from a book entitled Justice, What is the Right Thing to Do? By author, Harvard professor, Dr. Michael J. Sandel. The article in review, The Case for Equality by John Ross. Dr. Sandel wrote, "Most of us Americans never signed a social contract. In fact, the only people in the United States who have actually agreed to abide by the Constitution, public officials aside, are naturalized citizens, immigrants, who have taken an oath of allegiance as a condition for their citizenship. The rest of us are never required or even asked to give our consent. So why are we obligated to obey the law? And how can we say that our government rests on the consent of the governed?" John Locke says we're given tacit consent. Anyone who enjoys the benefit of a government, even by traveling on the highway, implicitly consents to the law and is bound by it. But tacit consent is a pale form of the real thing. It is hard to see how just passing through town is morally akin to ratifying the Constitution. Immanuel Kant appeals to hypothetical consent. And law is just if it could be agreed upon by the public as a whole. But this, too, is a puzzling alternative to an actual social contract. How can a hypothetical agreement do the moral work of a real one? John Ross, 1921-2002, an American political philosopher, offers an illuminating answer to this question. In The Theory of Justice, 1971, he argues that the way to think about justice is to ask what principles we can agree upon in an initial situation of equality. Ross reasons as follows. Suppose we gather, just as we are, to choose the principles to govern our collective life, to write a social contract. What principles would we choose? We would probably find it difficult to agree. Different people would favor different principles, reflecting their various interests, moral and religious beliefs, and social positions. Some people are rich and some are poor. Some are powerful and well-connected, others less so. Some are members of racial and ethnic and religious minorities, others not. We might settle on a compromise. But even the compromise would likely reflect the superior bargaining power of some over others. There is no reason to assume that a social contract arranged at this way would be a just arrangement. Now consider a thought experiment. Suppose that we gather to choose the principles. We won't know where we will wind up in society. Imagine that we choose behind a veil of ignorance that temporarily prevents us from knowing anything about who in particular we are. We won't know our class or gender, our race or ethnicity, our political opinions, our religious convictions, nor do we know our advantages and our disadvantages, whether we are healthy or frail, highly educated or a high school dropout, born to a supportive family or a broken one. If one knew of these things, we would choose, in effect, from the original position of equality. Since no one would have the superior bargaining position, the principles we would agree to would be just. This is Rawls' idea of the social contract, a hypothetical agreement in the original position of equality. Rawls invites us to ask what principles we, as rational, self-interested persons, would choose if we found ourselves in that position. He won't assume that we are all motivated by self-interest in real life, only that we set aside our moral and religious convictions for the purposes of the thought experiment. What principles would you choose? First of all, he reasons, we would not choose utilitarianism. Beyond the veil of ignorance, each of us would think For all I know, I might wind up being a member of an oppressed minority, and no one would like to risk being the Christian thrown to the lions for the pleasure of the crowd. Or would we choose a purely laissez-faire libertarian principle that will give people a right to keep all the money they made in the marketplace? I might wind up being Bill Gates. Each person would reason, but then again, I might turn out to be a homeless person. So I'd better avoid a system that would leave me destitute and without help. Rawls believes that two principles of justice would emerge from the hypothetical contract. The first provides equal basic liberties for all citizens, such as freedom of speech and religion. This principle takes priority over considerations of social utility and the general welfare. The second principle concerns social and economic equality, although it does not require an equal distribution of income and wealth. It permits only those social and economic inequalities that work to the advantage of the least well-off members of society. Philosophers argue about whether or not the party of Rawls's hypothetical social contract would choose the principles he says they would. In a moment, we'll see why Rawls thinks these two principles would be chosen. But before turning to the principles, let's take a prior question. Is Rawls' thought experiment the right way to think about justice? How can principles of justice possibly derive from an agreement that never actually took place? The moral limits of contracts. To appreciate the moral force of Rawls's hypothetical contract, it helps to notice the moral limits of actual contracts. We sometimes assume that when people make a deal, the terms of their agreement must be fair. We assume, in other words, that contracts justify the terms that they produce, but they don't, at least not on their own. Actual contracts are not self-sufficient moral instruments. The mere fact that you and I make a deal is not enough to make it fair. Of an actual contract, we can always be asked, is it fair what they agreed to? To answer this question, we can't simply point to the agreement itself. We need some independent standard of fairness. Where could such a standard come from? Perhaps you might think from a bigger, prior contract, a constitution, for example. But constitutions are open to the same challenge as other agreements. The fact that Constitution is ratified by people does not prove that its provisions are just. Consider the U.S. Constitution of 1787. Despite its many virtues, it was marred by its acceptance of slavery, a defeat that persists until after the Civil War. The fact that the Constitution was agreed to by the delegates of Philadelphia and then by the states was not enough to make it just. It might be argued that the defeat can be traced to a flaw in the consent. African American slaves were not included in the Constitutional Convention, nor were women, who didn't win the right to vote until more than a century later. It is certainly possible that a more representative convention would have produced a more just constitution. But that is a matter of speculation. No actual social contract or constitutional convention, however representative, is guaranteed to produce fair terms of social cooperation. Those who believe that morality begins and ends with consent, this may seem a jarring claim, but it is not all that controversial. We often question the fairness of the deals people make. and we are familiar with the contingencies that can lead to bad deals. One of the parties may be a better negotiator or have a stronger bargaining situation, or know more about the value of things being exchanged. The famous words of Don Corleone in The Godfather, "I'm going to make him an offer he cannot refuse," suggests in extreme form the pressure that hovers to some degree over some negotiations. To recognize that contracts do not confer fairness on terms they produce doesn't mean we should violate our agreement whenever we please. We may be obligated to fulfill even an unfair bargain, at least up to a point. Consent matters, even if it's not all that is to justice, but it is less decisive than we sometimes think. We often confuse the moral work of consent with our sources of obligation. Legal thinkers have debated this question for a long time. Can consent carry an obligation on its own? Or is some element of benefit and reliance also required? This debate tells us something about the morality of contracts that we often overlook. Actual contracts carry moral weight insofar as they realize two ideas: autonomy and reciprocity. As voluntary acts, contracts express our autonomy. The obligations they create carry weight because they are self-imposed. We take them freely upon ourselves. As instruments of mutual benefit, contracts draw on the ideal of reciprocity. The obligation to fulfill them arises from the obligation to repay others for the benefit they provide us. In practice, these ideals, autonomy and reciprocity, are imperfectly realized. Some agreements, though voluntary, are not mutually beneficial, and sometimes we can be obligated to repay a benefit simply on grounds of reciprocity, even in the absence of a contract. This points to the moral limits of consent. In some cases, consent may not be enough to create a morally binding obligation. In others, it may not be necessary. Sanders further writes, "I've argued so far that consent is not sufficient condition of moral obligation. A lopsided deal may fall so far short of mutual benefit that even its voluntary character can't redeem it." I'll now like to offer a further, more provocative claim. Consent is not a necessary condition of moral obligation. If the mutual benefit is clear enough, the moral claims of reciprocity may hold even without an act of consent. The kind of case I have in mind once confronted David Hume, the 18th century Scottish moral philosopher. When he was young, Hume wrote a scathing critique of Locke's idea of social contract. He called it a philosophical fiction, which never had and never could have any reality. One of the most mysterious and incomprehensible operations that can possibly be imagined. Years later, Hume had an experience that put to the test his rejection of consent as a basis of obligation. Hume owned a house in Edinburgh. He rented it to his friend, James Boswell, who in turn sublet it to a subtenant. The subtenant decided that the house needed some work, needed some repairs. He hired a contractor to do the work without consulting Hume. The contractor made the repairs and sent the bill to Hume. Hume refused to pay on the grounds that he hadn't consented. He hadn't hired the contractor. The case went to court. The contractor acknowledged that Humes hadn't consented, but the house needed the repairs, and he performed them. Humes thought this was a bad argument. The contractor's claim was simply that the work was necessary to be done. Humes told the court, but this is no good answer because by the same rule, he may go through every house in Edinburgh and do what he thinks proper to be done without the landlord's consent, and give the same reason for what he did, and the work was necessary, that the house was the better of it. But this, Hume's remained, was a doctrine quite new, and although altogether untenable. When it came to his house repairs, Humes didn't like a purely benefit-based theory of obligations, but his defense failed, and the court ordered him to pay. The idea that an obligation to repay a benefit can arise without consent is morally plausible in the case of Hume's house, but it can easily slide into high-pressure sale tactics and other abuses. In the 1980s and the early 90s, squeegee men became an intimidating presence on New York City streets, equipped with a squeegee and a bucket of water. They would descend on the car stopped at a red light, wash the windshield, often without asking the driver's permission, and then ask for payment. They operated on the benefit-based theory of obligation invoked by Hume's contractor, but in the absence of consent, the line between performing a service and panhandling often blurred. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani decided to crack down on the squeegee men and ordered the police to arrest them. Here's another example of the confusion that can arise when consent-based and benefit-based aspects of obligations are not clearly distinguished. Many years ago, when I was a grad student, I drove across the country with some friends. We stopped at a rest stop in Hammond, Indiana, and went into the convenience store. When we returned to our car, it wouldn't start. None of us knew much about car repair. As we wondered what to do, a van pulled up beside us. On the side was a sign that said, "Sam's Mobile Repair Van." Out of the van came a man, presumably Sam. He approached us and asked if he could help. "Here's how I work," he explained. "I charge $50 an hour. If I fix your car in 5 minutes, you will owe me $50. If I work on your car for an hour and cannot fix it, you will still owe me $50. What are the odds you will be able to fix the car?" I asked. He didn't answer me directly, but started poking around under the steering column. I was unsure what to do. I looked at my friends to see what they thought. After a short time, the man emerged from under the steering column and said, "Well, there's nothing wrong with the ignition system, but you still have 45 minutes left. Do you want me to look under the hood?" "Wait a minute," I said. "I haven't hired you. We haven't made an agreement." The man became very angry and said, "Do you mean to say that if I had fixed your car just now while I was looking under the steering column, you wouldn't have paid me?" I said, "That's a different question." I didn't go into the distinction between consent bias and benefit bias obligations. Somehow, I don't think it would have helped. But the contretemps with Sam, the repairman, highlights a common confusion about contempt. Sam believed that if he had fixed my car while he was poking around, I would have owed him the $50. I agree. But the reason I would have owed him the money is that he would have performed a benefit. namely, fixing my car. He inferred that because I would have owed him, I must implicitly have agreed to hire him. But this inference is a mistake. I wrongfully assumed that wherever there is an obligation, there must have been an agreement, some act of consent. It overlooks the possibility that obligation can arise without consent. If Sam had fixed my car, I would have owed him in the name of reciprocity. Simply thanking him and driving off would have been unfair. But this doesn't imply that I have hired him. When I tell the story to my students, most agree that under the circumstances I didn't owe Sam the $50. But many hold this view for reasons different from mine. They argue that since I didn't explicitly hire Sam, I owed him nothing and would have owed him nothing even if he had fixed my car. Any payment would have been an act of generosity, a gratuity, not a duty. So they come to my defense, not by embracing my expansive view of obligation, but by asserting a stringent view of consent. Despite our tendency to read consent into every moral claim, it is hard to make sense of our moral lives without acknowledging the independent weight of reciprocity. What do these various misadventures tell us about the morality of contracts? Contracts derive their moral force from two different ideals: autonomy and reciprocity. But most actual contracts fall short of these ideals. I'm up against someone with a superior bargaining position. My agreement may not be wholly voluntary, but pressured, or in the extreme case, coerced. If I'm negotiating with someone with greater knowledge of the things we are exchanging, the deal may not be mutually beneficial. In the extreme case, I may be defrauded or deceived. In real life, persons are situated differently. This means that differences of bargaining power and knowledge are always possible. And as long as this is true, the fact of an agreement does not by itself guarantee the fairness of an agreement. This is why actual contracts are not self-sufficient moral instruments. It always makes sense to ask, is it fair what they have agreed to? Imagine a contract among parties who were equal in power and knowledge rather than unequal, who were identically situated, not differently situated, and imagine that the object of this contract was not plumbing or any ordinary deal, but the principles to govern our lives together, to assign our rights and duties as citizens. A contract like this, among parties like these, will leave no room for coercion or deception or other unfair advantages. Its terms would be just, whatever they were, by virtue of their agreement alone. You can imagine a contract like this. You have arrived at Rawls' idea of a hypothetical agreement in the initial situation of equality. The veil of ignorance ensures the equality of power and knowledge that the original position requires. By ensuring that no one knows his or her place in society, his strengths or weaknesses, his values or ends, the veil of ignorance ensures that no one can take advantage, even unwittingly, or a favorable bargaining position. If a knowledge of particulars is allowed, then the outcome is biased by arbitrary contingencies. If the original position is to yield agreement, that are just, the parties must fairly situated and treated equally as moral persons. Arbitrariness of the world must be corrected for by adjusting the circumstances of the initial contract situation. The irony is that a hypothetical agreement beyond a veil of ignorance is not a pale form of an actual contract, and so a morally weak thing. It's a pure form of an actual contract, and so a morally more powerful thing. Suppose Rawls is right. The way to think about justice is to ask what principles we would choose in the original position of equality, behind a veil of ignorance. What principles would emerge? According to Rawls, we wouldn't choose utilitarianism. Behind the veil of ignorance, we don't know where we will wind up in society, but we do know that we will want to pursue our ends and be treated with respect. In case we wind up to be a member of an ethnic or religious minority, we don't want to be oppressed, even if this gives pleasure to the majority. Once the veil of ignorance rises and real life begins, we don't want to find ourselves as victims of religious persecution or racial discrimination. In order to protect against these dangers, we would reject utilitarianism and agree to a principle of equal-based liberties for all citizens, including the right to liberty of conscience and freedom of thought. And we would insist that this principle take priority over attempts to maximize the general welfare. We would not sacrifice our fundamental rights and liberties for social and economic benefits. What principle would we choose to govern social and economic inequalities? To guard against the risks of finding ourselves in crushing poverty, we might at first thought favor a equal distribution of income and wealth. But then it would occur to us that we could do better even for those on the bottom. Suppose that by permitting certain inequalities, such as higher pay for doctors than for bus drivers, we could improve the situation of those who have the least by increasing access to health care for the poor, allowing for the possibility we would adopt what Rawls calls the difference principle. Only those social and economic inequalities are permitted that work to the benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Exactly how egalitarian is the difference principle? It's hard to say, because the effect of pay differences depend on social and economic circumstances. Suppose higher pay for doctors led to more and better medical care in impoverished rural areas. In that case, the wage difference could be consistent with Rawls' principle. But suppose paying doctors more had no impact on health services in the Appalachia and simply produce more cosmetic surgeons in Beverly Hills. In that case, the wage difference would be hard to justify from Rawls' point of view. For Rawls' case, for the difference principle doesn't rest entirely on the assumption that people of the original position would be risk averse. Underlying the device of the veil of ignorance is a moral argument that can be presented independent of the thought experiment. Its main idea is that the distribution of income and opportunity should not be based on factors that are arbitrary from a moral point of view. We've been reading Justice, What is the Right Thing to Do by Harvard professor Michael J. Sandel.